Hello and welcome to Dialogue of Civilizations. One cannot separate national sovereignty from the question of power. A man inhabiting a resourceless, God-forsaken island is indisputably sovereign, yet not powerful. Sovereignty is not a precious stone to be hidden away in a Swiss safe deposit box, but an instrument of active, self-beneficial, rule-governed application. Sovereignty in the modern age is never absolute. It could be limited by virtue of self-imposed voluntary restrictions or by means of agreeing to the transfer of fundamental state powers to a supranational union in the shape of the European Union, for instance. Such a self-imposed treaty-based limitation on sovereignty is primarily undertaken out of the necessity for survival or for the sake of projecting a greater influence or power by individual nation-states on the international stage. However, when a state is unable to perform two fundamental functions of a sovereign nation-state, namely it cannot project authority over its territory and peoples and cannot protect its national boundaries, thereby involuntarily losing the element of vital control, it becomes a failed state. This is a summation of modern Syria. The total cost of state failure is massive and borne also by the neighbors of failing states. For the purpose of defending their borders and counteracting any danger emanating from a power vacuum in their immediate environs, they may find themselves compelled to assume control over a certain portion of the territory of a given failed state, with some possible permanent consequences. My guest today is Filip Kalmarević, Editor-in-Chief of the news portal Nation from Belgrade, Serbia, with whom I intend to discuss the wider intricate relationship between sovereignty and power, and also the subject of the pursuit of luxury as an act of transgression. Mr. Kalmarević, thank you very much indeed for joining us today.
Thank you for your introduction, and I'm glad that I have opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's start with modern Syria. Syria, even in the aftermath of the fall of Damascus and removal of Bashar al-Assad, remains a failed state, for it has not assumed full control over the full scope of its territory. It's still kind of rising from its ashes, bearing in mind that there are so many external actors involved in this process with conflicting interests. What should be done internationally to ensure that Syria becomes a proper functioning sovereign entity?
Thanks for the question. I think that Syria, the situation in Syria essentially caught many countries involved in international politics off guard, in a sense that many didn't predict that something like this would happen or that it would end up like this in such short period of time. Anyway, what I saw in a few days that I followed this conflict in Syria is that the West essentially changed its position towards cooperating with the before called terrorists, now moderate terrorists in Syria. I find that not surprising, but in a way interesting. We already saw those cases a few decades ago all over the Middle East and also Asia. So that's something that's interesting, considering is Syria a failed state, of course. Also, there's a question of is democracy in a way built for every nation and every country all over the world, especially is it this kind of Western democracy really something that other countries in Africa, in Asia, in other parts should look for and try to replicate. So I think that essentially every country has a right to, and that's the question of sovereignty, to determine what's the system that best fits them. But also we have a question of, international law, United Nations, human rights that are not respected all over the world.
Yes, indeed. You think that democracy is probably a matter of choice for many countries. It's not an absolute necessity. Probably the first fundamental thing is to have a proper sovereign state. And one of the attributes of a sovereign state is to be able to protect its national boundaries and to have self-sufficiency in terms of military prowess. And democracy is sort of a natural consequence of evolving from one stage to another, I suppose. But the government of Assad had heavily, until its ultimate demise, relied on Russia and Iran to prop itself up. Can a nation, any nation, not just Syria, be regarded as truly sovereign if it cannot maintain the security of its borders and territorial integrity without external assistance, even if by external assistance we understand some sort of treaty-based guarantees provided by external actors?
So what we saw in Syria is essentially that we still don't live in a multipolar world, how some would describe it. I think that we saw that United States of America are still dominant superpower, and that only country that can maybe in a few decades be in that position also of a superpower is China. But also there's a question of how we determine superpower states or regional power states, or how we determine the power of states as overall, in a sense that do we look for nuclear power, do we look for military power, economic power? And in a way, I think that we still live in a world designed by United States. Considering sovereignty that you just spoke about, there are a few main things that determine is a country sovereign or not. First thing is international recognition. Second thing is border. Third thing is people on its territory. And the fourth thing is authority, project of power, government, however you want to call it. And currently we have very few of those things in Syria.
Yes, indeed. And how hopeful are you that those who are currently in charge of Damascus, the capital, mainly are related to HTS group, which has a past which is slightly murky, could actually form a future for Syria on the basis of the principle of inclusivity, taking into account all the interests of all Syrians? Because the fundamental point there for many people is that, and in particular we notice it when we hear statements coming from Western countries, that they all welcome the fall of Bashar al-Assad, but they're not entirely sure what is to come. And how hopeful are you that what is to come will be something that will make everybody happy eventually? Because there seems to be absolutely no alternative to the current situation.
Yeah, I don't think that we will see in a foreseeable future any normalization of relations between conflicted nations and countries in the Middle East. I think what is more likely to see is more regional conflict between, I think, three dominant forces in that region: Iran, Turkey, and Israel. Considering Syria, I don't think that in any foreseeable time we will see any of those things like inclusion, democracy. But what I saw is that many Syrian immigrants in Europe celebrated the fall of Assad. And what I also saw is that a few of those countries, I think Germany, maybe even Britain, does not anymore accept asylums from Syrian refugees. So we'll see if that ends up. There'll be deportations maybe of some people that are living in Western Europe, and those who are from Syria, I think, have a lot of things to worry about.
We always notice when we hear statements coming from Ankara, from Washington, and from other centers, that they all talk about the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Syria, all external actors, even including Iran. So we understand that territorial integrity of Syria is very important. So to change the subject completely now, I said earlier that sovereignty cannot be understood apart from the question of power. For example, Serbia does not recognize self-declared independence of Kosovo. So I want to connect the subject of sovereignty with power. So apart from being a question of principle for Serbia not to recognize Kosovo as an independent state, but also, is it also connected with the notion of power in a sense that by not recognizing Kosovo, Serbia retains this exclusive right of later, subsequently, claiming a de jure and de facto sovereignty over Kosovo? Because as we understand, Serbia cannot do anything in terms of effective control over Kosovo, but by retaining this power as an element of power, it could still at a later stage assume full de facto control over Kosovo. Is it connected with the necessity of not losing power?
So essentially, a few minutes ago, I told you about the 4 things that determine is country sovereign or not. At the moment, we have that situation in Kosovo, and if you look at those factors, the only thing that stops, let's say, Kosovo from becoming fully respected member of United Nations and recognized country all over the world is that only half of countries that are members of United Nations recognize Kosovo as independent state. Considering other factors, like I said, for example, the border. The border is controlled by Kosovo institutions, self-proclaimed Kosovo institutions. And also we have at the moment that even though we have a border with Kosovo, Serbia, Kosovo does not have a border with Albania, which I think represents a major risk in the region for stability and peace. Also, other things that I mentioned are people. For years, we have thousands of people leaving Kosovo, particularly Serbs from the north, because it became dangerous to live there. I was there this year in February. Majority Serbian municipalities are at the moment ruled by Kosovo Albanians, even though they represent only a few percent of population in those municipalities. And also we have government or state authority, and the only thing that and they all controlled by Kosovo, because we signed a few bad agreements in the last 15 years that resulted that government essentially moved from the north. We had a control over few institutions like economy, also justice, police, and many others.
Indeed. But it's done bilaterally between Belgrade and Pristina. But the question is to what extent this bilateral arrangements will lead to the recognition of Kosovo as a sovereign state by Belgrade. And my question was primarily based on the idea that by not recognizing Kosovo as a sovereign state, does Serbia still in the process of thinking that it is some element of power which should not be given away at this juncture? And thank you very much for explaining all of these nitty-gritty details related to those relations. I earlier mentioned about power and sovereignty. Some Western experts, for example, now are saying that in the view of the circumstances established on the ground in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, it is very unlikely that Ukraine will be able to fully restore its sovereignty over those territories which are currently under Russian control. And there has been an idea proposed by some Western experts that eventually Ukraine will lose those territories, and in the trade-off between retaining formal sovereignty over eastern Ukraine and actually having a truncated version of Ukraine with a better opportunities, becoming member of European Union and NATO, eventually, in the fullness of time, Kiev may choose the latter, not the former. I perfectly understand that this is not the subject of today, but it's a question of losing sovereignty over a certain portion of territory, in return getting better opportunities in terms of power. Of course, this is not something which will be discussed at this juncture of historical development, but how do you view the concept of losing something instead of, and in return getting bigger opportunities in the long run?
So essentially, we live in a broken international law system designed by United Nations. Yeah. We have many powers like China and Russia having concerns for how long this system can keep on working. Also, we have same voices of from United States and Israel, I think, especially especially some influential public voices. Considering Ukraine, I think that it is inevitable that there will be some sort of a peace deal that end up taking those territories from Ukraine and giving it to Russia. And I am not sure is the membership of NATO for Ukraine on the table. And I watched an interview of the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Russia, and he essentially said membership of Ukraine in NATO and that only minimal deal that they will accept is that those 4 regions be and given to Russia.
Indeed, but if that happens, really, if Ukraine loses that section of its sovereign territory, it will be a huge blow to modern international law and modern international system. Do you think that if that happens, we're talking about a certain uncertain, probable scenario, of course, will that be end of the modern post-1945 international legal system?
I don't think that will be the end, but I'm certain that will mark some new era of international relations, considering that international law is less and less important to big powers. Mostly some powers like Russia and China seize power from that United States and other Western countries, their allies, did some terrible things, really, in Yugoslavia, wars in Middle East over last few decades. And I think that we are going back to 19th century, early 20th century style of deals, of politics, of geopolitics.
Talking about 19th century politics, to what extent do you think that this rules-based limitations imposed on sovereignty are driven by the necessity of ensuring that sovereignty does not become some sort of pursuit of luxury leading to transgression? When you talked about 19th century politics, I remembered this concept of unfettered sovereignty, which is described as a luxury. For example, I think French philosopher Georges Bataille, in his critical text on sovereignty and desire, explains the pursuit of luxury as an act of transgression accompanied with the infringement of rules. So effectively, if to apply this subject to sovereignty, we need to have certain limitations on a given sovereign polity, which is capable of exercising sovereignty, in order to make sure that it is not able to go beyond the rule-based system. So to what extent do you think that we will still need at some point later to set crystal clear rules ensuring that sovereign states are not driven by this principle of might is right? Because quite often what happens is that the rules are not being followed, and sovereign states are creating a new reality on the ground, and on the basis of those new facts on the ground, we start establishing new rules.
Yeah, I think that it is essential that most powerful countries in the world sit down and try to either stick to current rules or try to reform them so that they fit the 21st century. I think that we have a conflicted principles at the moment. For example, principle of sovereignty, what we talk about tonight, and principle of self-determination that was essentially designed for overseas territories of empires in the 19th and early 20th century. But it was applied to Kosovo situation, and also Russia applied it to situation in Ukraine, considering these few regions. So I think that we need adults in the room to sit down, either agree to fully respect current rules that are determined by United Nations resolutions, or either to rebuild United Nations on a different basis for this century.
Mr. Kalmarević, thank you very much indeed for your time and for your answers. Most grateful.
Thank you.
This was Filip Kalmarević, Editor-in-Chief of the news portal Nation from Belgrade, Serbia. Near absolute sovereignty is very costly and impossibly expensive for the preponderant majority of countries. However, sovereignty on the basic bare minimum level is a necessity. The dialogue of civilizations, in addition to involving interactions between cultures and civilizational forces, also involves effective communication amongst those state actors capable of making sovereign decisions. Looking forward to welcoming you to the next episode of Dialogue of Civilizations.